first thing I want to make very clear is that I'm not a psychic and I'm not a channeler. A lot of people get me mixed up with that because of my work with the Nostradamus prophecies. I'm a hypnotherapist. I've been doing hypnosis into past lives for 17 years. This is called past life therapy, past life regression, where you take the person into the other lifetimes to find the answers to problems in this lifetime. And it's a form of therapy that's becoming more and more popular. So this is the type of work I've been doing for 17 years. And along the way, I've found some very interesting stories where people have gone into lifetimes where they have been associated with famous people in history, or been in a time when something important was happening in history. And this is mostly what I've written my books about, have been these exciting stories that I have found through people's past lives. So I consider myself to be the reporter, the researcher, and I call myself the researcher for lost knowledge. I have to put all the information together and do the research into it and present it in the form of books. So I'm not a psychic and I'm not a channeler, I'm simply a reporter. That's what I consider myself. But with the Nostradamus material, that was totally different of an ordinary regression session. So it is part of my work as a hypnotherapist. They say it's the strangest case that's ever happened in the history of hypnosis. You can't call it channeling, you can't call it hypnosis because it is so different. It was actually going back through time and contacting Nostradamus while he was alive, living in the 15th century, 1500s in France. But it happened totally by accident. About 10 years ago in 1986, when I was working with a woman who just wanted to go into a past life to see if she had a past life. There was no problem, she didn't want any therapy. But during the course of the regression, some very strange things began to happen. We didn't set out to contact Nostradamus. I don't think you could have. It was something that was totally unpredicted and simultaneous and spontaneous. But during the course of the session, she went back to a lifetime where she was a student of Nostradamus in France. And that's when everything got very strange, because as this male student, she was talking about Nostradamus, and suddenly she said, "He wants to speak to you." And I was totally, shocked, because anyone who does this kind of therapy knows that does not happen in this kind of therapy. And she said, "He has a message for you. He had been looking for a link to the future, because he could see that the prophecies where he had written were not being correctly interpreted, and the time was coming when they were going to come true. So he says he has an assignment for you. He wants you to get the book that has the prophecies in them, in French and English, and he wanted me to read them to him, and he would tell me what they meant and explain all of the code that has been lost for 400 years. He would explain every symbol, every anagram, and tell me what part of history. And at that time, I didn't even know what a quatrain was. The quatrain is a 4-line poem, in the case of Nostradamus, a 4-line prophecy, and he wrote almost 1,000 of them. And not even half of them have ever been correctly interpreted. And some of them have been interpreted after the fact, after they've already occurred. So it was quite an assignment. But when the woman woke up and I told her what she had said, she was so frightened she moved to Alaska. So you can't say I started it, you can't say she started it. There was something very peculiar at work here that is still difficult to explain to people. But we had time for one more session before she left. I think she was trying to appease me more than anything, and it was helped with packing boxes and suitcases, and she was having a garage sale. And she said, "I have 1 hour to do the session," and then they were having a going away dinner for her. But during the session, he came through again, and he said, "I still want you to do this work." I said, "I can't, she's moving away." He said, "That doesn't matter. Now that we have made this connection, I will come through anybody you work with." And he gave me the instructions how to locate him and a test to perform so I would know I was actually speaking to him. And this is why it ended up with 3 volumes, because over the course of 3 years, it went through 12 different people. He did what he said. He would come through anybody I worked with. It was like having his telephone number, And I could call him up anytime I wanted, and I'm still able to do it if we want to get some more information. But we successfully translated all of the known prophecies, almost 1,000 of them, and I had the unenviable job of putting them in order, in a chronological order of some kind. It took a computer to do it. But the translations were coming so fast at the height of our work that as fast as I could read them to him, he was giving it back. We were doing 30 translations in an hour. It's absolutely impossible for the human mind to do that. It cannot think that fast. But he was telling me what all the symbols were, the anagrams, and he broke the code. Then I had to use a computer to put it together. So it ended up with 3 books because it took many twists and turns along the way. And none of the people I worked with knew anything about what the other ones had said, but yet they continued the same scenario, the same story he was trying to get across to our time. There was no deviation, no matter what prophecy I read. I found later it wouldn't have mattered if I would have started at the beginning of the book and read straight through, because they are in no set order. They're not in chronological order. I would just open it to anywhere in the book and check off after I'd read it. But at the height of this, they were just coming so fast, 30 in an hour. But there's another part to this that makes it even stranger, is he was most emphatic. He said, "You must understand you are not speaking to the dead. I'm not a spirit floating around out here somewhere." And he wanted me to be very sure that I emphasized that. He said, "You are speaking to me while I am alive, living in France, writing the prophecies." And you know what that brings up, if that's true? It's the metaphysical concept of simultaneous time, that there is no time, that everything is occurring all at once. Very strange and very difficult concept to but this is what he said. I am contacting him while he is alive. That's why I consider it having his telephone number. But I got to know him very well, and he is really a very definite personality, and there was no way we could mistake it when we had contacted him. Okay, because they all described his physical appearance as being the same. But his eyes especially were very penetrating and very strong eyes. But he had a definite temper. He would get very upset with me if I had not done the correct research. He would tell me exactly where to go in the libraries to find the information. And in breaking the code, a lot of it had to do with ancient Greek philosophy, and Greek history, and Greek legends. Because he said this way he could fool the Inquisition by thinking he was commenting on history. And actually he was foretelling an event. But when I didn't quite understand what he meant, he kept saying, "I'm appalled at your lack of education, because we don't have to learn those things in our time period." But he would tell me where to go in the libraries to find them. And if I did not do the research exactly, he would have this very stern temper. But it was as though you were with a very stern schoolmaster, I think would be the way you would classify it. As though you were a student with someone who had all this knowledge and trying to learn from them. But also, I found out that he was very definitely a male chauvinist. And I said that was okay, because during the time periods he lived in, women were not educated. They were not taught anything. And he didn't have the same relations with women there that we would today. So I could understand that. But it was a very definite personality. The main reason was the Inquisition, because he was living during the time when the church was very powerful, and to do anything like this, he would have been condemned to death, or he said he would have taken his land away and thrown him into prison. So he had all these visions, and what is he going to do with them? At first he was writing them down in a kind of a diary, but he knew that if he died, they would be found and they would be burnt. So how was he supposed to protect the prophecies, to get them to our time period for which they were intended? The only way was to devise this code. And anagrams were very popular in France during that time period. So he was using something he was familiar with. And he made these anagrams and puzzles. And there were, that's why he was almost 1,000 of them. He said there were actually about 1,500, but some of them have not survived to our time. But he had to do it to confuse the Inquisition. And it worked because they have come down to our time, even though they've been undecipherable in most cases. The main reason that he said he was making this contact was because he wanted us to help change the futures. He said, a lot of people don't like Nostradamus because they say he's doom and gloom, very horrible predictions. He said, if I show you the most horrible things man can do to himself, will you do something to stop us? The worst case scenarios of what would happen if nobody did anything at all. He saw time not as one future set in concrete, but as many branches, many probabilities and possibilities off of an event. So he was showing us the worst case scenario off of any of these paths that you continued on. So he believed that mankind could change the future, especially if you knew what that future was. So his job was to tell us, this is what's going to happen if you continue along this path. And he said that man doesn't know the power of his own mind. If you knew what was going to happen and focused on the opposite scenario, the opposite effect, that could be our future. We could create that with our minds. But he also said, if the power of one man's mind is that powerful, imagine the power of group mind. That if you get groups of people focusing on the opposite, on peace and harmony for the world, you could truly create miracles, because the power of the mind at that point would not only be multiplied, it would be squared. The power would be tremendous. And this is what my message has been as I travel all over the world, is tell people they can change the future. They are not puppets. They do not have to go along with what is predicted. We can have a wonderful future if we just know about it, focus on it, use our minds. We're so scattered. Our energy is very scattered. When you focus that energy, it can be tremendous. But the problem is that the predictions are coming true. But if we know we can make changes, maybe that's the point. Will we do it? Mankind does have free will. And he told us exactly where they went in history. And from his time to ours, there were hundreds that had dealt with the past, as we consider the past. He said, don't worry about those, because they'll only be interesting to people who are interested in history. Focus on the next 20 years, and this was from the 80s when we were doing this. But in those, there was tremendous amount of things that have already come true. He even named Pasteur in one of the quatrains by name. And the famous Hister quatrains, there were many of those, but I even found out more quatrains dealing with Hitler besides just that one. He had all the phases of all the wars from his time to ours, and he had many, many inventions, which he called by the names of metal beasts and fish, like submarines, like metal fish, because he didn't know what else to call them. He predicted air flight. He was very definite about a lot of these things. And he had many predicting the atomic bomb that have never been interpreted till now. One I thought was interesting was where he talked about the stone in the tree. The stone being the bomb, and the tree, how we always think of the bomb as represented by a mushroom cloud. To him it looked like a tree. And in the quatrain he talked about the stone in the tree as the explosion of the atomic bomb. But not only did he talk about wars and inventions, he talked about every philosophical trend that man would go through. These were all very important to him. So there were many, many that have already occurred. And since I began working with him, and the books were first published in 1989, so it's on record before the Gulf War began, he gave us the dates for the beginning of the Gulf War 3 times. And he talked about Saddam Hussein in anagram form before the Gulf War ever started. And parts of this have not come true yet, so we know we're not finished with Saddam Hussein or the wars in the Middle East. But many of the events in the last few years have been documented before they occurred. We were given the The ones for the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had 3 quatrains that were explained to us before the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was very definite about the wall in the east will fall. And we were told about the breakup of the communist countries, that they would pull away from Russia, some peacefully and some violently, to where Russia would be reduced to the original size of Russia and Siberia. And all these things have come true since my work began with him. So there are many, many of these have come true. And as we're now going into the 4th printing of Volume 1, so much has happened that I've added an addendum, 50-page addendum to the back of the book of events that have just come true in the last year alone. And it's really amazing. And a lot of it has to do with computers, World Wide Web. These were very definitely predicted. He didn't call it World Wide Web, but he talked about the world being hooked together with wires all over the world dealing with computers. And a lot of these predictions are very frightening because they are coming true. And I thought maybe in 100 years, but now in less than 10 years, the things he saw about computers and experimental weaponry are happening in our lifetime. So it is now, it's right up to the minute. Nostradamus said, if we can just get through the decade of the 90s, we'll be okay. See, he saw this horrible war that he referred to as the Third World War. And there were many, many predictions dealing with the third Antichrist that he saw that would be the instigator of the Third World War. And he said, if you can just get through the 90s, he called this the time of troubles. Just get through this without going into this war. Keep it on the lesser scenario, the less violent scenario, we'll be fine. Because after the year 2000, we're going to be going into wonders you cannot even believe. But he saw the possibility of a terrible war that would be not only atomic, but biological weapons, chemical weapons, germ warfare, the most horrible things you can imagine, that he verified for us. And some of these things I thought, well, it sounds like science fiction. But he said, no, it's already invented, and your scientists are working on them. But I let that go until I began to get letters and phone calls from people saying, it's not fiction, I know because we're working on these things. So we're sitting right now at a very volatile time. We could go into this most horrible war, or we could stay like we are. But if we can get through the 90s, then we will go into the 1,000 years of peace after we're into the year 2000. Because he saw a figure coming along at that time that he called the great genius. Now, if the Antichrist is the epitome of evil, of everything that is terrible, he said this great genius would be the total opposite. Because he said the pendulum cannot swing all the way to the very evil man and stay there. It must swing back to balance. And when it does, it comes into the time of the great genius. And he will have such wondrous inventions. We will be living in space, traveling in space, having space colonies. The human body will be perfected to the point that it will never die, and will be in the 1,000 years of peace. So this is the time I like to focus on, rather than the terrible things he saw. He said he wanted us to know there was a wonderful future ahead of us. We can just get through the end of the 90s. He said there will be more things happening in the 90s, more significant events than have ever happened in the history of the world before. And I like to say it reminds you of the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. But he believed that we chose to live here at this time, because he said by living now, you could work off as much karma in one lifetime as you would normally take 10 lifetimes to do. This is why we have so much happening all the time, so much coming at us from all directions. We're trying to work off a great deal of karma at this time. But he said you chose to be here, and it can really be very good for the people if they will stick with it and do it. But the great genius, that is part of what's going in the addendum. The internet has been very helpful with this, because Nostradamus saw the next wave of computers. The first one was going to be, would operate by voice, which they're working on now. The next ones would be by thought, and I've heard that this is being worked on. But during the time of the great genius, there would be an organic computer. and that it would be able to duplicate human parts, duplicate human bodies. And he saw the great genius as transferring his intellect into this computer so it would be there to guide us through the 1,000 years of peace. We'll also be running all the power that will power the world and the space stations. But on the internet, I found out that they are working now on computers based on DNA. That they say they will be 1,000,000 times faster and more accurate than anything we have now because of the way that the DNA transfers information. This is how they will be able to transfer information using the same thing. Because they have gone as small as they can go with chips. The next step is cellular. So they said everything is going to go down to the tiny, tiny level of cells. And this is all in the field called nanotechnology. Nano meaning very, very tiny. And it's amazing because we were given this information 10 years ago, and it's happening now. It's all coming about. That he said that the great genius would transfer his knowledge into this. They say this is very possible because all it is energy. And it'd be very possible within the next several decades anyway. It is an interesting question that what happens with all the people, because, well, we're going to be living on space stations. We're traveling in space. Probably a lot of us will want to go live on the moon or on Mars or something. But it might be at the point that maybe we won't be producing, reproducing as fast as we are now. It's possible. Because of my work with the aliens and the UFO work, they don't die until they're ready to die. So there's no need for new beings to be born if they're going to stay on the earth longer. I don't know what would happen there, but I think there'd probably be ways of working this out, maybe going to other places. Like a new adventure is all opening up out there. Well, Nostradamus said that from the time he was a child, he always had visions. He thought everybody had these things. He was very amazed when they told him this was forbidden. But he could always see things from the time he was a child, and he knew about the cosmos. In his day, they thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, of the sun. Everything was rotating, around the Earth. And he knew different, even before the times of Galileo. But he had to be careful what he said. But he'd been able to do this since he was a child, and he often wondered where it came from. And he knows that it came from God. It was a gift from God, because otherwise, he said, why would he have been able to do it? I think he was a man out of his time. He was way ahead of his time, because the time of the Inquisition, he couldn't tell these things. But he did believe it came from God. He didn't know about being chosen. He thought of it more as a curse than anything else, because it did affect his life in many negative ways. Well, I think Nostradamus is recorded as being the most accurate there ever has been. Of course, Edgar Cayce falls in with that. He also went into trance. We found that Nostradamus would go into trance, and that's how he found these things. He would see the visions. And he said he would wake up, he would find that he had written the 4 lines with automatic writing. He said, I saw all these things, but yet I wrote 4 lines that referred to everything he had seen, which is about the same way that Edgar Cayce would do. He would go into trance and also have visions. There's probably been many others, but I think Nostradamus is the one that's the most famous. But I don't believe that, because we do have free will. And the idea is if we know what's going to happen, we can have control over it. I think it's the job of any psychic to try to warn people. Even a modern day psychic, when they see something happen, they'll try to tell you, don't get on that train, or don't take the car today if they see something happen. Otherwise, why have the vision if you don't try to help the people and warn them about it? So that was his primary purpose, was to let people know what was going to happen. Then, of course, if they ignore the warning, if they take the train anyway, or if they do get in the car, it's their own free will that has done that. Because we are a planet with free will, and we have to respect that. Because they said it would not be a test if you knew the answers. But still, when it comes to things of this magnitude, if you have warnings, you can do something about it. That's not really taking away from the lesson, because you still have the choice of which way you want to go. Most people think that at the year 2000 this is going to be the end, or if we have it in this war, or even if we go into the Earth's shift, the shifting of the continents, they think that is the end of the world. But it's not. Mankind is a survivor. He will continue to go on. Even if there are many lost, there will always be some around that will survive. Man is, he's here forever. So I asked him one time, well then, if this is not the end of the world, what is? And he said, many people have asked him, you could see so far in the future, how far can you see? He said, I can see to the end of the world, but not the end of time. He saw the world being destroyed when the sun went supernova. And when it would supernova, it would blast out all this heat, and the Earth would be incinerated. But he said, you don't have to worry about it. That's so far in the future that when it does occur, there will be no people on Earth. They will have long since gone somewhere else. So you don't have to worry about it, but he could see how it was going to end. So we're going to have many things between now and then. But man is a survivor. He will always be around. There's much information out here about what they're calling the Earth shift, or the shift of the axis. This is what would happen if all of the, say for instance, the polar ice caps would melt and all of the water would rush down. This would be caused very easily by an Earth shift. The Earth is sitting right now at an angle, a slightly off-center angle. And some of the people who have talked about Earth shifts say we'll do a complete flip-flop. We have no information about that. The only thing we have is that it would take a slight tilt. It wouldn't have to be very much. A slight tilt would be enough to begin the ice cap melting and to send the water rushing down out of Canada. But it's enough to do it that the tectonic plates will be forced against each other. They will be moving. Because when we did our maps, we thought, this is strange. Why are some of these areas being left when, according to the elevations and geology, they should not be left? They're not high enough. The mountain areas, you can see why they would be left. The other areas, why would they be left? Nostradamus explained that as the Earth takes that slight tilt, the tectonic plates will move. They will be forced against each other. So the center part of the United States would be forced upward as much as 2,000 feet, while the outsides would drop off, California and Florida. That's what happened on many of the continents, a forcing upward and then a dropping off because of the movements of the plates against each other. Now, many people have maps of what will occur, and I've done conferences with these different people, and mine are the worst. They show a lot less land left than any of the other maps. So I said, it doesn't mean that any of us is right or anyone is wrong. We all have pieces of information. Mine, again, seemed to be the worst case scenarios, as he was trying to show us the absolute worst would happen if you go to the extreme. If you will notice my map of the United States, there isn't very much left. The black areas are the areas that are left. The center part of the United States is the biggest section. That is the part that he said would be forced upward by 2,000 feet, while the other areas will be dropping off. California, most of what will be left will be the tops of the mountains as islands, a series of islands. And Texas and Florida, all those areas would drop. But the second map is dealing with Canada, and it's hardly any land left there because it's closest to the Arctic Circle. And as the water comes down, it floods all of those lakes. Those lakes come down and flood the Great Lakes, spread out the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, so you can see how most of that area would be underwater. South America is the same thing, would be mostly the mountainous areas like the Andes that would be left, and the other areas where the Amazon River, that would go down. So this part of the hemisphere would be the mostly affected as the amount of land that would go underwater. This would occur because with the tectonic plates shifting, you would have terrible tidal waves, earthquakes of unknown proportions. The volcanoes would be going off all over the world. Terrible storms. They said there's nothing on earth that could prepare you for this. It would be something that's never happened in our memory. We could not be prepared for the violence of this when it occurs. The one of Africa, see, the same way, the Mediterranean would be completely overflowing into the top part of Africa, and the desert areas would be underwater. The Holy Land would be all underwater, and it would be broken up into pieces. Europe is, most of that will not be under its effect. There'll be some parts of England that will be affected, and as you can see, France and Spain, as the Mediterranean moves up, and some of the Nordic areas because of the North Sea overflowing. But when I gave a lecture in Holland, and they looked at the map, they said, we don't need to look at that map to know we're going down. They said we were in a 3-story building, and they said this whole building would be underwater if that dike breaks out there. So they know that whole area is very vulnerable. It could all go down very easily. And there's a whole lot more to the part about Europe because he has many quatrains referring to England during this time, and that there would be so little land left that many of them would go to France to live. So there's a whole lot of prophecies dealing with the earth shifts. And the last one is the Asian continent, which will be the least affected. China a lot of it will disappear, but he said the Russian part of the Asian continent will have cracks, but it won't break up to the extent that the other areas would. Japan will have new land rising because of volcanic action, as will New Zealand and the Hawaiian Islands because of increased volcanic activity. But that is the least affected will be the Asian continent and the part of Russia. And of course, what continent don't I include in these?
Australia.
Australia. And when I'm in Australia, they always say, where are we? Can you figure out why I have not included Australia? It's not going to change.
Okay.
And of course, when I'm in Australia, they all stand up and cheer when I say that, you know. But he said Australia was a unique continent because there was nothing for it to push against. It would move, it would float. Of course, it's going to have storms, it's going to have tidal waves, it'll have earthquakes, but it won't break up like the other continents will. It will be able to move. And this gives it a very unique quality over all the rest of the continents of the world. But this is the information we got, and like I said, let's consider it the worst case scenario because the other maps that are coming out are much, much easier and a lot more land is left. A lot of people are thinking this is going to occur by the year 2000. We found there's going to be a lot of very important events occurring by the year 2000, but not the earth shift. It's way too soon for that. And other ones will argue with me about it, but I can only give you the information that we have. One of the quatrains was so complicated, we wrote a whole chapter on it. There was so much information in those small 4 lines. It was like peeling an onion. And I found the most important quatrains had the most information in them, were the hardest to decipher. And we had 3 astrologers working on that quatrain because it contained astrological dating. But they have all come up with a slightly different date. And this was dealing with the date of the Earth shift. Now, one of them, they said it would be 2004. The other one said 2029. I prefer the later date. Let's get it as far away as possible. But that gives us plenty of time anyway. But he said by 2029, and I believe it was going to be in October. The dates are in the books. We have the horoscopes for the dating that they came up with. But it's done like a detective story. All the clues are there. And another astrologer may come up with something totally different than what we found. But this is all part of it, the deciphering of the mysteries of the quatrains. The problem was it's never been translated until now because they mistranslated it from the French. One of the most important clues was that they translated water for Aquarius. And an astrologer will tell you that Aquarius is a water bearer, and it has the glip of the wavy lines, but that is not a water sign. So it was never been able to be deciphered before because they were interpreting it as Aquarius. We had our astrologers go after a water sign. And when they searched for a water sign, because the whole quatrain was full of other astrological signs, they couldn't get that one to match. When we looked for a water sign, they were able to come up with the dates. So it's the first time it's ever been translated. But he said it dealt with the dates for the Earth's shift. As I said, someone else may do the same thing, follow the same clues, and come up with a different date. That's it's part of the mystery. But he said the things we're doing to our environment and to our whole world is speeding up the process that could lead to the Earth's shift. But some people have said it's going to be very sudden. Other ones say it could be a gradual process. It is already occurring. The Earth shift started several years ago. And right at this time, it's a gradual process. This is what's causing the increase in the earthquakes and the increase in the volcanic eruptions. He said first the earthquakes would appear where they've always appeared, then they would appear where they've never appeared before. And you would have the volcanoes that have been dormant for hundreds of years will be reawakening. You have the changes in the weather and the changes in the climate. All of this is happening now. This is a gradual process. As long as it's happening gradually, we can handle it, even though there are disasters involved. It's that sudden shift is what we don't think we can handle. And part of this relates to what we're doing to the environment. And he also said you have to stop the underground nuclear testing because that's reverberating through the plates, it's speeding everything up. So it can be looked at both ways. It could either happen gradually or it can happen quickly, depending on what mankind does to the world. So we are here again in a position of deciding what we do with our world. Nostradamus saw in his future 3 men that he called antichrists. One was Napoleon, the second one was Hitler, and the third one is the one that is to come, who is said to be the worst of all because he will learn from the mistakes of the others. A very dangerous person. He didn't like the term Antichrist. He said it was a Christian term and it was not exactly what he meant. But he said if you think of Christ as representing people, humanity, then Antichrist is someone who does terrible things against humanity, against people. And it can be the type of personality like Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun, the type that doesn't care anything about what it's doing, it only wants power. So this is what he meant by an Antichrist. But the third one, he gave us a great deal of information about him because he wanted us to do something to stop the man. He said, in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, and other books in the Old Testament, the people saw the same things that he saw, the prophets did. They only put them in their symbolism they could understand in their time, but they all saw the same thing. And that the man he refers to as the Antichrist is the number 666 in the book of Revelation, called the beast. Of course, he said 666 also refers to his connections with computers. So there's a lot more to it. But he has been predicted as far back as Bible times. So he said he has a destiny to fulfill. He has to come, but after he comes, what happens after that is in the hands of mankind. Do we allow it to go through the worst case scenarios, or can we lessen it? That's the point. But the man is alive now, and he has his destiny to fulfill. We were given a lot of information about this man because he is so important. We have his horoscope. He was born on February the 4th, 1962, in Jerusalem, but he's not Jewish. And his parents were killed during the Israeli war, and when he was about 6 or 7 years old, and he was raised by his uncle. His uncle is a very evil man, and we have had many people see him, and we have, in my work, and we had one woman who was able to put together a police composite picture of the uncle and of the Antichrist. She was a psychic who had worked with police on many cases, so she knew how to do the police composite kits. But the uncle took the young boy and was raising him as his own. What the young boy doesn't know was that the uncle had his parents killed, so he could have him for his own. And he has gotten together a very powerful group of rich Arabs in the Middle East, and they've been taking care of this young boy and grooming him for the role he is to take. It's a very powerful group of people that control everything that happens in the Middle East. They're the puppet masters behind the scenes. Nostradamus said, by the time 7 puppets arise in the Middle East, you will realize what is happening, that they are not the real leaders of the countries, but they are the puppets being manipulated by the puppet masters behind the scenes. The young Antichrist went to college in Egypt, and we were working on this at the same time he was in college, so we were shown several scenes of him in college. We knew where he was living. We had all this information. His main courses that he took were economics, philosophy, and computers. The computers were going to be very important in his future that he was planning. But after he got out of college, he lived on the different estates of these very rich people. He has no home of his own, but travels around to the different estates. And we saw him once in a big estate on the banks of the Nile, and another one in Syria, and in Oman during the Gulf War. Oman is to the bottom of Saudi Arabia. So we saw him in all of these places during the Gulf War, and he's traveled around from place to place. But Nostradamus said, you must remember that in the beginning, this man will appear as a savior, the man with all the answers, the man with the golden tongue. This will how he will make his conquests in the beginning. But he said, you must remember he's not what he appears to be. He's the wolf in sheep's clothing. Because by the time people realize what is happening, then everything will all come out. We were told in 1995, if you were watching, you'd become aware of these people and what they are doing. And of course, I get lots of mail from people trying to tell me who they think the Antichrist is. But a lot of the people they have told me about, I think, are members of the group. They're very rich, but I don't think they are the Antichrist because they don't fit all of the other criteria. I think we are on the way because everywhere I go all over the world, people are taking this message and they're saying they want to do this. They want to go back to their different groups and tell people you can make a difference. It can happen. And even during the Gulf War, it only lasted a month because of all the protests people had about it, even before it started. So maybe we can change the future. Maybe that was why it only lasted a month. Maybe it's why it didn't go on further. And maybe we can keep it from reoccurring because he sees going to be a succession of wars in the Middle East. We're not finished there yet. And he saw that we would go to war in the gray area of Europe, which he called the gray area because he said you don't know if you're in Europe or if you're in Asia. And he used the terms Macedonia and Albania. He had no term for Yugoslavia, but this was the gray area. And he said by 1995, you will make the decision if you're going to go to war or not. Well, we sent our troops into Bosnia during that year. So we are going along with the scenario, but I'm hoping by just changing one little thing, we can change the worst that he saw. It's like everything, one little event can make a big difference. Because he said, if you look back on World War I and World War II, you will see all these little things that preceded it. But at the time, you were not aware of where it was leading. And at the present time, that's what's happening. The Gulf War was the beginning of the Third World War. In the future, we'll look back on that and see that was where it started and escalated from there. But we can hope that it won't do that maybe we'll be able to stop it, keep it in a lower key. I would like nothing better than to have all these prophecies not happen. It's not only multiplied, it's squared. The power is tremendous. So after the books came out, I traveled all over the world. I would lecture all day long. Sometimes I'd lecture for a week, every day on a different part of the prophecies. And that was my job, was to tell people, if you have metaphysical groups, if you have prayer groups, any kind of a group that would meet regularly, if you can go back and just take 5 minutes out of that time to focus on the opposite of what he was predicting, we can keep these things from happening. And we can perform a miracle. And that's what he told me to do. And I was doing that for many years, all through the 90s, really. I think I stopped lecturing on it toward the end of the 90s. But during that time, a lot of these things did come true. And then now, the worst isn't. So I'm going to be playing a video, and I want you to show you what's going on here with that, because I'm coming up to all kinds of conclusions. But first, I do want to tell about some of the ones that have come true. People for years have been saying, I'm sitting here reading these books and watching it happen on television. That's how up to date it all is. The 2000 election, remember that election? Oh, yeah. Bush and Gore was in there in the minutest detail. Ever since the book came out, people kept calling me every time there was going to be an election. This is before the days of internet. And they would say, is this going to be the year of the hung jury election? I said, I don't know. All I know is what you got in the books. Because he saw an election that was what he called the hung jury election, as though it's so close you can't make a decision. And I probably should have brought it to read it, because there's such tricky symbolism. Nobody in all the scholars who have studied the prophecies have never come up with an answer like this. In the prophecy, it talks about the bones of the dead, and they come up with it, somebody, a ghost or something like that, and our haunted cemetery. And that's not anywhere near, it's his symbolism. So nobody has ever come up with the answers that we came up with. He said it would be an election, and it would be at a time when there would be a lot going on in the world, where it would be very important to be at a time of war. And this could be a very important election, but he said it would be so close that nobody could find the winner, and even the Congressional Congress would not be able to come up with a winner. And this is a whole page of this prediction. And some of you have read the book, so you know what I'm talking about, don't you? The ones who have read that prediction. And he said in there, an interesting thing, he said it would come so close that it might even cause a civil war, because everybody would be rooting for their candidate and to be very angry about it. And he said the only way a decision would be made would be after another election had occurred. Well, I think he saw all this counting of the ballots over and over again, and that's what he meant. But anyway, that one prophecy is extreme detail. And also, Bush was not supposed to win. He was not supposed to win. Gore was supposed to win. Can you imagine the difference in the last 8 years if Gore had got in there with his focus on ecology and the environment? What a difference the world would have been. But it was not supposed to be that way. Bush is predicted many times in the prophecies. And who would have known there was going to be two? Because some of the prophecies applied to the first one and some of them applied to the second one. He doesn't say the name, but it's definitely this time period. And he talks about the wars in Iraq. All of that is in there. He also talked about the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which is interesting. But
So some of these, you never know what's going to be in there, and it's only when it's happening you say, oh, that's what he's talking about. But another one that did happen was the 9/11. And it's funny, I was lecturing the night before the 9/11 happened, was in North Carolina. I've been there for some conferences, and I had one last talk at this little center with a small group before I was going to leave the next morning. And we're staying at this person's house overnight. That night, during the lecture, I was talking about the prophecies that dealt with that. Because in one of the prophecies, he definitely mentions the bombing of the Pentagon, and he says Pentagon in the prophecy. We were talking about this during the lecture. And the next morning we get up and here's showing on TV, with the bombing of the World Trade Center and all of that. An interesting thing about the prophecy about the Pentagon, you've probably been hearing all this controversies, conspiracy stuff that's been on emails and TV, is because a bomb will fall on the Pentagon. He never called it a plane or anything. And there's a controversy about that. Was it even a plane? Because the videos don't show a plane. Who's to say? He said it was a bomb in the Pentagon. Well, there'll be a lot of this, although we're ever going to know the answers to. But he did mention 9/11. He didn't mention the date, but he talked about hitting New York. And he said it's hard to say what's going to happen because he said this is going to be the first of many. There will be many attacks on New York after that. So it was hard to separate them out. But all of these things were definitely in the prophecies that were happening. There's so many, but those are the main ones that I've had. We tried to keep up with it, didn't we? For a while, we had it on the website, the ones that were the updates. And every time I would reprint the books, I would add to the back of volume 1 some updates. But it just got to be impossible to keep up with all of it. Then it was hard to do it on the website. So anyway, it just kept going and going. So a lot of what he focused on was the third Antichrist. He said there were 3 Antichrists. And I'm going to play a video, and a lot of this information will be in there, because he said he didn't like the term Antichrist. He said it sounded religious. But he said if you refer to Christ as humanity, that an Antichrist was someone who did something against humanity, a person who had no morals, and like he said, Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun. He said, actually, if you want to consider that, you could say there were 5 Antichrists, because he considered Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan is also this kind of a personality. So he said, if somebody like that, so the 3 Antichrists that he saw was Napoleon for his time period in France, and he has lots and lots of quatrains dealing with Napoleon. And also Hitler. And we had many, many of those. And when I was on the History Channel, they wanted me to name off these. I don't know what they're going to put in this program. For a while during the 1990s, I was on every show dealing with Nostradamus, every network, every documentary. There's so many out there. And now they're not calling on me as much because it's kind of fading away. But over the years then, I began working on my other books and lecturing on that, and I kind of got away from the Nostradamus material. But one thing he did say, this evil man who was supposed to be the 3rd Antichrist, he's supposed to come from the Middle East. We have his birth date, we have a drawing of him, and you're going to see it on the video. He said, this man would be the worst of all of them because he would study from Hitler and he would learn from his mistakes. And this was where we were supposed to be by the beginning of the 2000s into this horrible war. And I like to think that maybe we took another turn and went into a lesser. We have the wars, but not the wars he saw. He saw horrible things. He also saw a lot of that were being done with weaponry, and some of those are being developed by our own government. He had many quatrains dealing with AIDS, and he told us how that developed, and it was a government weapon. And I told him, when this was going on, I said, I can't write this stuff. They're going to hang me from the highest tree. But that was what I had to put together. But anyway, as he's going through all of this, he says, the Antichrist will eventually be defeated by the common, ordinary people. He called it the lice at his feet, what he thought was insignificant. He mentions Ogmios, who was an ancient Celtic Hercules, who is the leader of the underground, who was supposed to come against the Antichrist. And I kept thinking, wondering if this was going to happen or not, but Nostradamus said the Antichrist has been predicted as far back as the Bible. He's the beast in a Revelation, the beast with the number 666. And that deals with computers, and I'm also going to be going into that too. But those are the, does she? Okay. He said this is why this was a man, this was so horrible, we had to know about him so we could stop it from happening. But he said, the way that the history is going to go, the pendulum cannot swing all the way to the very evil man and stay there. It must swing back. And when it swings back, it's going to swing back to the time of the great genius, the wonderful man. He said, at that time, you will be living in the 1,000 years of peace that's mentioned in the Bible. It'll be the wonderful time of, well, he said, the human body will be perfected to the point that it will never die. And we will have wonderful computer advances, and he didn't like computers. He was talking a lot about that. We'll be traveling in space, living in space. And he mentioned, in the last half of volume 1, he mentions all of the wonderful inventions and things that are going to be coming during the time of the great genius. So I like to kind of think that maybe we are skipping over the real bad times and going into the time of the great genius. Who's to say? But I want to bring you up to that part. Okay, Greg, I think we can play the video now. This was a show that was on Sci-Fi Channel. And I really liked the way they put it together, so I kept it and I've used it.
World wars, man's landing on the moon, and the coming of a new Antichrist. Was Nostradamus warning people of the inevitable, or was he giving us the power to change our fate? Nostradamus lived in the 1500s, a time of fear and superstition, when plagues ravished the earth and the church ruled the fate of people. He had visions of mankind's terrible future and its own destruction. Not unlike our time, many people then believed that his predictions were satanic. The church would put him to trial.
That's him! That's Nostradamus!
You were accused of the worst of all crimes: black magic, alchemy, worship of the devil.
He would continue his work, however, feeling that it was his duty to inform us of our fate, so we could change it and create a better future for ourselves. His predictions that have come true. World War I and the beginning of communism. World War II, the rise of the Third Reich. Jewish massacres. The atom bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And natural disasters. He also predicted the advancement mankind would make. The invention of aircraft, the first landing on the moon, and man's constant search for answers in space. These advancements will not go without mistakes, disastrous mistakes. The Vietnam War, a war out of control, and the Challenger, a dream shattered. Dolores Cannon is the leading expert on the Nostradamus predictions today. In 1986, something unexpectedly happened to her. As a past life hypnotherapist, she conducted what she thought would be a normal past life regression. A patient went back to a past life when she was a male student of Nostradamus. Nostradamus spoke through this patient.
I still have a hard time explaining what happened. He came through her and he said, I have an assignment for you. He could see that his prophecies were not being correctly interpreted. He said the time is coming when they're going to come true.
I have to warn people. If they keep on like this, they will destroy everything. Nature, themselves.
Nostradamus gave Dolores the correct meanings of his predictions one by one. It took 3 years and 12 hypnotic subjects to complete the work. This was the first time that all Nostradamus' predictions have been translated. Almost 1,000. Nostradamus told Dolores Cannon to concentrate on the next 20 years.
20th century will be especially terrible. 3 wars will spread over the entire earth.
And we have shown now that some of the prophecies have already begun to come true.
In the world's history, thousands of people were killed by plagues, epidemics, illnesses with no cures. Not unlike our own time that has been struck with its own plague, AIDS. Nostradamus said that AIDS was a mutated disease, a form of rabies that originated from a monkey biting a woman who lived in Africa. The disease got into the blood mobiles and laboratories, contaminating biological products being made. AIDS will continue to spread worldwide. A cure is predicted about 15 years after the spread of this disease. The date of the Gulf War was given to Cannon long before it occurred.
He said, you don't know how important this is. This is the beginning of everything. This is actually the beginning of the Third World War.
This would instigate a few wars in the Middle East. The worst, however, is still to come.
There would be one man behind the scene during all of this time. This is the third Antichrist.
Nostradamus saw 3 antichrists in the course of Earth's existence. 2 were already predicted correctly, and we know them. Napoleon, Hitler. The third has already been born, and said to be the worst of them all. Nostradamus wanted our time period to know about the third Antichrist, so something could be done to stop him. This last Antichrist is the same entity referred to in the book of Revelation as the beast with the number 666. Nostradamus gave Dolores Cannon a detailed description of the third Antichrist and even a sketch drawing of him through the help of an artist. He was born on February the 4th, 1962, in Jerusalem. In 1987, he was a student at an Egyptian college specializing in computers, business, and philosophy. Presently, he is in the background of everything that is happening in the Middle East. He is described by Nostradamus as an extremely handsome man with tremendous charisma. At first, he will appear as a savior and the man with all the answers. But he will be the opposite of what he appears to be. He will be the sheep in wolf's clothing. His work is secretly done now. How many of us know him already? There were more events predicted for our future that Nostradamus wanted us to be aware of. The Nazi Party will slowly but surely return to power during the 90s. It will come to light that hurricanes are a man-made event brought about by scientists attempting to control the weather. The next 2 decades will mark the downfall of the Catholic Church. The Earth's continents will shift with the rising of the ocean's water levels. This could occur during the next 4 decades. These are just to mention a few. This all sounds like gloom and doom, but Nostradamus saw the amazing ability for the human being to adapt. We could handle the changes as long as they are occurring gradually, as they are now. Nostradamus also gave us a glimpse of a wonderful time to come. He saw a man whom he called the Great Genius, an important figure whose coming would balance out all the evil in the world. The Great Genius would invent great wonders, and he would reign in the 1,000 years of peace when we would be traveling through the cosmos and living in space colonies. One question remains to be answered, though. How could we explain all of this?
I want to bring out a very important point that really shakes people up. In my work with him, he was most emphatic by saying, you are not speaking to the dead when we are communicating. It's a concept of not simultaneous time, that there is no time.
We look upon Nostradamus as a mystery, but as facts prove, he was an extraordinary human being with an extraordinary talent. Could we prepare ourselves for Armageddon?
Nostradamus saw the end of the world, but he said it's so far in the future you don't need to worry about it.
Cannon merely sees herself as a reporter with only the well-being of mankind at heart. Nostradamus said that people underestimate the power of their own minds. He said that it is up to us to change the world's fate and create a better future for ourselves. How could we possibly ignore this?
But I did that about 10 years ago, I think. But one thing that's interesting in there, we did the stuff about AIDS, and I told them the real story of AIDS, that it was a government weapon that was developed. And they said, we won't be able to get on the air with that. So they adapted it and changed it. That was the only part that they did change. But he saw it being developed as a weapon of war because they said you couldn't, it was supposed to be like a germ warfare type of thing, but it got out of hand. It mutated and went over the edge. When that happened, there was no way the government or anybody else was ever going to take a responsibility for it. Now, what he said in there about the cure would be found in 15 years, that did happen. It was not exactly a cure, but from the time we did all of this and did the work, 15 years later, they had reduced AIDS down to where it was no longer in the top 10 killers of the world. They had found enough drugs to put it under control. So that part did come true. Another part in there where they talk about the weather control. There's a whole lot of that in the books about the government enveloping weapons where they can control the weather and influence the weather. And it makes you wonder with all the stuff that's happening, the hurricanes and things like that. And if you know anything about the HAARP project, do you know about the HAARP project? The one in Alaska, that they are experimenting with weather and experimenting with the magnetic fields of the earth. There's a lot going on that we aren't aware of. I don't know if you know about my radio show. I have a weekly radio show. And I have all these people on the show, and I do have the man who wrote the book, Angels Don't Play This Harp. He was the one that exposed the whole thing, and we had him on the show. I wanted him to come and talk to this conference, but he couldn't get here this time. Maybe next year, anyway. He's got a lot of things that the government's doing that you really don't want to know. But the HAARP project's another one of the weather focusing machines. And so there's a lot of these things happening. So imagine when you're getting all this information, and it's pretty heavy stuff that I was receiving. And I didn't want it to believe it could happen, but then it begins to develop. Trying to think what else on there that has happened. Oh, definitely. Oh, he had the whole chapters and chapters on the Catholic Church. And I kept telling him, you're just wishful thinking. Because he was being harassed by the Catholic Church during the time of the Inquisition. And I thought, that's all it is, you just don't like what you're living under. And he said, I do agree it's wishful thinking, but I'm only telling you what I see. And he kept saying the Catholic Church was built on sand, and it eventually would collapse. Interesting, what he said it would collapse from, he said it would collapse from within. And look what's happening with all the scandals that are happening. He said it would collapse from within. And it is being brought down. But he said in time now, as it begins to come down, religion will return to what it was supposed to be in the beginning. In my books in Jesus, you know, that was the way religion was supposed to be. And no one person over and everything telling people what to do. Nobody making rules and regulations about sins. None of that was ever supposed to be in there. It's not in the Bible originally. And so he said it would all return to the way religion was supposed to be when Jesus set it up 2,000 years ago. When Jesus set it up, he called it the way. And it was supposed to be having meetings just like this, and people in people's homes, and people sharing their knowledge and their abilities, teaching each other how to heal, and all about love. That was what religion was supposed to be. And that's what Jesus taught when he was doing his traveling. But man took everything and turned it around, changed it, and he ended up being crucified. They never understood what it was really all about. But Nostradamus said that religion will return the way it's supposed to be. So we're in for a whole wonderful thing when this, the great genius comes and we go into a whole new way of thinking. Yeah?
I remember you writing about how one of the popes was to be assassinated, and the next one would be poisoned, and then the third one would be the downfall of the church.
That'd be the last pope.
And can you see how that hasn't come true, how we've taken a different road?
That's what I'm wondering. Can you hear her okay? Because we got okay, and we thought nobody wants to come up to the mic, so she's talking about the predictions with the popes, because he saw all of the popes. And he did see that in this time period would be the last of the popes, that there was going to be 3, and the last one, when he was assassinated, that would be the downfall of the church. He called it the Pope of the Antichrist. But that's when I kept wondering, some of these things have not come true. And I kept wondering, well, does this mean all of this is wrong? I don't believe so, because some of them have come true. Then I got to thinking a while ago, he kept telling me over and over again, she's got her hand up here too, he kept telling me, remember that nothing is set in stone. The future is not in stone. It's malleable. It can be changed by man. One decision can change an entire timeline. And he kept saying, I want you to tell people how they can change the future. Maybe we've done some good, and we have changed it to where we're not following the worst case scenario. That's what I'd like to think, and that was what was coming to me this afternoon. It's not that it's inaccurate. I'm glad that it hasn't happened the way he saw it, because it was really horrible. Maybe it means we have turned a corner and are going into the time of the great genius and the wonderful things that he saw ahead of us. I like to think that. We don't want to have this war come. But he did say that the Antichrist had been seen since the Bible times. Does that mean he's still in the background and is just not being as effective, or what? He had a lot about the Cabal. And I didn't even know what the Cabal was when I was writing the books. It's the government behind the government. And he's got a great deal of prophecies dealing with that. And when I started lecturing on that, people were saying, you're talking about the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers and the Rothschilds, and I didn't know any of that. But it was exactly what people had talked about, the government behind the governments all over the world. And he said they were descended from banking families going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And that now look at the banking things that are happening today. But this were the ones who were really controlling the governments. But see, a lot of these things I really didn't want to know. But here that I had to go out and lecture on all of this. So it was not what I wanted to do. But go ahead.
As I see it, Pope John Paul was supposed to be assassinated. But again, we had choice. And he wasn't assassinated because people around the world, Catholics and not-Catholics, prayed. And that could have been your assassinated Pope. Because really, he was at death's door.
You talking about the assassinating the Pope? I always have trouble understanding when somebody's with the micro. What is she? She's my translator. Yeah, everyone.
The way she sees it is the one...
Use the microphone.
Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Am I any less distorted?
Okay, go ahead. When she sees it, what?
Okay, that Pope John Paul was assassinated. He was supposed to die, but he didn't because of the prayers.
Well, the
From
one
people.
who only had the short, was only in there a month or so, Nostradamus said he was poisoned. And it was a poison that would appear to be like a heart attack. And that then the next one coming in, they couldn't control him, and that was why they poisoned him. But you know, there was the one, where he was supposed to have been, he was shot, wasn't he? And then he survived. So, you know, it takes all these twists and turns, because he had many quatrains about the city by the junction of the rivers at the time when the roses bloom, was supposed to be at the time that the Pope would be assassinated. And, but some of these things have not happened. So, like I said, he sold us the worst case scenarios. Maybe we are avoiding it and we're going down the other road.
Did he ever say
What?
Did he ever say what his name meant?
Whose?
Nostradamus.
Whose name?
Did he ever say what his name meant?
Well, Nostradamus was Michel de Notre Dame.
Which means Our Lady.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But he was Jewish.
So was she.
He was raised with a Jewish family. We found out more about his biography than anybody has ever known. He was Jewish, and their family had to convert to Catholicism, or they would have been killed or driven out of France. So they changed to Catholic because they had to, and Nostradamus was never happy about that either. But there was, we learned a lot about his life and a lot about the conditions of that time that, to me, it was living history. But he also, let me show this one piece here before I get into this other. I have one little thing I want to show there. Let me say something first and then we'll show it. Okay, he saw a lot about computers. You got to remember, this was happening in 1986. I got my first computer in 1985. And you know those kind, if you remember them with the MS-DOS, and they were the very first computers. I was so afraid of that thing. I would be typing on it, type a chapter, and then I'd put it on save, and I'd go out of the room. And I couldn't stand to sit there, because sometimes it wouldn't save, it would destroy everything that I'd written. And I could see all these words floating out in cyberspace, you know. And so I'd push the button, and then I'd get out of the room until it saved it. And I would print it out immediately because I didn't know what it was going to eat the whole thing. So we didn't have much of a computers. This was the beginning. So here he's giving us information on computers. And he didn't like computers. He could see them. He said, man was giving up too much of his power to machines that we should be doing ourselves. And he didn't like it at all. But he saw the development of computers. And he saw the computers like we had. Then he saw computers that were going to be activated by voice. And you know, they are now. Then he saw computers that were going to be activated by thought. Well, in the last few years, this is happening because the Japanese discovered it. They did it for handicapped people, but they made it to where all they had to do is think to the computer and it would turn itself on and off. They're making all kinds of machines do the same thing. Just by thinking at the computer, you can tell it what to do. And I think that's amazing because they said it doesn't matter what language you speak. The thought is the thing. Now that's exactly how the ETs communicate. It has nothing to do with language, it has to do with thought. So they are kind of catching up with the ETs. But the Japanese have figured out how to do this by operating computers by thought. Now this is going to catch on because it knows it's going to spread. But the only problem is the government always turns these things around to weapons of war. But that he saw that development. Then he saw the final computers were the organic computers. This is the ones that the great genius would be using. He said it would be able to replicate itself and take care of itself. And I said, organic sounds like something that's living. He said, it definitely is. And when I began to do research on it, in those days, they had developed one that was operated with bacteria. And they said they could take a cube the size of a dice, and it would hold all the information in the Library of Congress. And then they've been experimenting since with proteins. They said they're making it to process it just the way the body processes DNA and processes information to the brain. It'll be 1,000,000 times faster than any computer you're working with today, and it'll hold millions more information than you're doing today. And I've got a lot of information on this, articles and things that have been sent to me. Not too far in the future, a computer will be like nothing more than a bowl of water. It's how far in advance it is. But look what they're doing with all of the electronics. Look how small they're getting. So the computers will be able to be organic, living. A little creepy. But when he was trying to explain all of this, you know, Brenda had no words for this. I didn't have any words for it because it didn't exist. And I kept thinking, here in 1985, I said, oh yeah, maybe in 100 years these things would come true. At 5 years, they began to be developed. 10 years, they were being developed. So that's scary. It was way ahead of his time. Now, we're going to, he's got, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. Before we're done, I'll tell you that. Okay, let me finish this thought first. He saw the World Wide Web before it was ever invented. He didn't have a name for it. Nobody did in those days. He saw it like the world with all of these strings and cords wrapped all around the world. It was all like a mass of strings. And he said it would all be into a central computer somewhere that would control the whole entire things. And when I was lecturing on that, one place, somebody said, I think it was somewhere in Europe, they got a gigantic computer. It's called the Beast, that is supposed to operate the entire system. But he described the World Wide Web exactly. Okay, Greg, put this one up here. Okay, this is something that one of my readers sent to me after the books came out. And usually when I show this, people want to write it down. This is numerology, and people say, that's not numerology. It's not the numerology as we know it. It's the numerology from thousands of years ago, the Chaldean Hebrew Kabbalah system of numerology. This woman tracked this down. World Wide Web reduces to 666, and www releases to 666. No matter how you break it down, it comes up to 666, World Wide Web. I wonder if that was by accident or not. Because you know in the book of Revelation, that's what it says, that 666 is the number of the beast. And I quote it in the book because it talks about computers. That eventually nobody will be able to buy, sell, or do anything without the mark. Without the number. Everybody will have a number, which has happened. And we'll need that, and that's where they talk about the mark of the beast, and it goes back to 666. Who would have thought that? This came from a woman in Australia, I think it was. So, it's interesting. I wonder if when they come up with the World Wide Web, if they knew numerology or not. Who knows?
Dolores, may I make a comment? In the Hebrew alphabet, the sixth letter is Vav, which is V or W. So VVV or Vav would be 666. One more time.
Does that make sense then?
Exactly the same.
Because I don't know that system, but people said it's not numerology, it's a different kind of numerology. Okay, you can take it down now. Okay, but I think that's fascinating. And thanks for giving us that little bit of information there because I know you do know languages, and you think it is accurate then. But is it by accident, or did they know that when they were first in developing all of this? Who knows? What? It makes you wonder, is anything coincidence or not? Okay, we've only got another 15 minutes. There you can see how there's so much with this. I talked for a long time. Okay, he was asking about 2012. Well, Nostradamus talked about the shifting of the world. He gave us the maps in Conversations Volume 2 of what the world would look like. Because he said the world would not have to tilt, but just a little bit for the continents to start to shift and the tectonic plates to move. And once they began moving, they would displace a lot of water, and there'd be a lot of flooding. And continents would go down, and continents would be pushed up. And there were some places, I ended up with maps of the entire world, because I wanted that rather than just the United States. Some places, he said, I looked at these maps and I said, this doesn't make sense. I could see where mountains would be above water, but there were some parts of the United States that should not have been above water. He said that's because the tectonic plates will push against each other, force the land mass up as much as 1,000, 2,000 feet. This area is one that's going to be safe. It will be forced up over 1,000 feet. This area, isn't that weird? My son said, well, that means we're going to be okay, isn't it? I said, no, there'll be earthquakes, there'll be, if you can hold on, I guess, there's going to be all kinds of violent activity. But he describes the worst things you could imagine as the continents shift and as the increase in, he did say, talking about the government controlling everything, he said, watch the weather. He said, first, there will be earthquakes where they've always occurred. Then there will be earthquakes where they've never occurred before. And he saw machinery that would be in airplanes, and they would be beamed at the earth and can create earthquakes. Then he said, watch the ring of fire, the reawakening of the volcanoes. Some of them have been dormant for hundreds of years. All of these things have been happening during the 20 years that I've been working on this. And then he said the weather will become increasingly strange. In one of the quatrains, they call it mistake of the month. He said it would be areas that were normally cold would be hot, and vice versa. There's several quatrains dealing with that. He talks about periods of drought. In one quatrain is the year without a rainbow, which he talks about the droughts. Then he talks about flooding. It's a great deal dealing with the weather. So all of this about the shifting of the earth, during that time I was getting phone calls and letters from people saying, should I move? Where should I move to? I got to get my son out of San Francisco. And I said, I can't tell you what to do, where to go. That's your responsibility. I said, just follow your instincts. You'll be where you're supposed to be. Follow your instincts. If you feel you should move, then move. If you feel you should stay, then stay. I know we're having a lot of increase of population moving into this area. And I don't know where they're getting these vibes or what it is, but definitely California's going down, Florida's going down, all of those areas. And so who's to say? But anyway, there's a great deal about the shifting of the earth, and I got to wondering about that. But then what I think is happening now, in my books on the convoluted universe, I'm getting into the new earth, the changing of the vibrations and the frequencies as we move into the new earth. And they say we're going to leave the old earth behind. There's going to be two earths.